The clinking of champagne glasses sounded like a death knell to Isabella. From her velvet seat in the shadows of the grand ballroom, she watched her husband, Richard, raise a toast. He wasn't toasting their 10 years of marriage, nor the child she carried secretly within her. He was toasting Serafina, his star architect, his muse, his mistress. Serafina, bathed in the golden glow of the spotlight, laughed, her head thrown back in triumph. They thought this was their night, a celebration of their success built on the foundations of Isabella's silent heartbreak. But they had underestimated her. They didn't know that the real story of the night was just about to begin, with a grand entrance that would bring their gilded world crashing down. The ballroom of the Astoria Grand was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of crystal, gold leaf, and ambition. Hundreds of tiny lights glittered in the vaulted ceiling, mimicking a starry night sky. But their cold, brilliant light offered no warmth. For Isabella, perched on a plush velvet armchair in a secluded alcove, the splendor felt like the interior of an exquisitely crafted tomb. It was the annual Sterling Gala, the crowning social and professional event for Richard's architectural firm, a night he usually insisted she attend as his perfect, smiling wife. This year, however, he had suggested, almost insisted, she stay home. "Rest, my love," he had cooed, his voice a silken trap. "For the baby." But Isabella knew the real reason for his concern, and it had nothing to do with her well-being. The real reason was currently standing on the stage, basking in the adulation of the city's elite. Her name was Serafina, a name that sounded like a whisper, but a woman who was a storm. Serafina was Richard's protégé, the brilliant mind behind the firm's latest triumph, the Skyline Spire, a building that pierced the clouds and had already won a dozen awards. She was also the woman who had been sharing her husband's bed for the past 2 years. Isabella had known for 18 months. She hadn't found lipstick on his collar or incriminating texts. The discovery had been far more insidious, a gradual dawning of a horrific truth. It was in the way Richard's eyes would linger on Serafina, a moment too long during company dinners, the shared private smiles that felt like a physical blow, the late nights at the office that stretched into early mornings. The final undeniable proof came from a private investigator's report, a slim manila folder filled with grainy photographs that had shattered her world. Tonight she watched them from afar, a ghost at her own husband's feast. Richard was the picture of success in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his charismatic smile flashing for the cameras. He stood beside Serafina, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The gesture was subtle, almost professional, but to Isabella it was a brand, a claim. Serafina was radiant in a crimson dress that clung to her like a second skin, a stark, fiery contrast to the muted dove-gray gown Isabella had chosen. Isabella had wanted to be invisible tonight, to observe without being observed. Her dress was a shield, a camouflage against the opulent backdrop. She instinctively placed a hand over her belly, a gentle, protective gesture. At 4 months pregnant, she was only just beginning to show a small, hopeful curve that was her secret, her anchor in the turbulent sea of her life. Richard knew about the baby, of course. He had feigned excitement, his eyes shining with a well-practiced sincerity that no longer fooled her. He had called the baby their new beginning, a fresh start, but Isabella knew it was just another lie, another beautifully constructed facade in their carefully designed life. The gala was a celebration of the Skyline Spire, and by extension, a celebration of Serafina. Richard had made that clear in his opening speech. He had spoken of her unparalleled vision, her relentless drive, her unique genius. He had never spoken of Isabella with such passion, not even in the early days of their marriage. She had been his partner, his support system, the quiet, steady force that allowed him to build his empire. She had managed their homes, hosted his clients, and sacrificed her own career as a gallery curator to cultivate his. She had been the perfect corporate wife, an elegant, unassuming accessory. And now she was being discarded for a newer, shinier model. The irony was not lost on her. Richard, the master architect, was demolishing the foundation of his own life to build a monument to his ego. A waiter gliding silently by offered her a glass of champagne. Isabella shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "Sparkling water, please," she murmured. The waiter nodded and disappeared back into the throng. She ran a finger around the rim of her empty water glass, her gaze drifting back to the stage. The award ceremony was over, and the orchestra had begun to play a soft, romantic melody. Richard, ever the gentleman, was leading Serafina to the dance floor. They moved together with a practiced ease, their bodies swaying in perfect harmony. They looked like a king and queen celebrating their victory, oblivious to the world around them. Or perhaps they simply didn't care who was watching. The pain in Isabella's chest was a familiar ache, a dull, constant throb that had become her shadow. For months she had been drowning in it, suffocated by the weight of Richard's betrayal. She had cried until she had no tears left, her grief a raw, open wound. But tonight, something had shifted. Watching them together, so brazen and unapologetic, the grief had begun to curdle, to harden into something else. It was a cold, sharp-edged anger, a feeling so foreign and yet so powerful it almost took her breath away. She had spent a decade building a life with this man, a life he was now so casually dismantling. She had given him her youth, her love, her loyalty, and for what? To be replaced? To be rendered invisible? No, not tonight. Tonight they would see her. Tonight they would all see her. She took a slow, deep breath, the air filling her lungs with a newfound resolve. The gilded cage had become a prison, and she was done being its silent, beautiful captive. She was about to break free, and the sound of shattering glass would be a symphony. The alcove that Isabella had chosen as her vantage point was a small, velvet-lined pocket of solitude, shielded from the main ballroom by two massive marble pillars. It was a place for quiet conversations, for clandestine meetings, for observing the intricate dance of power and desire that played out at events like this. It was here that she had first met Richard 10 years ago, when she was a bright-eyed art history graduate, and he was a rising star in the architectural world. He had wooed her with promises of a life filled with beauty and passion, a partnership of equals. Looking back, she realized he had been designing her life just as he designed his buildings, with precision, ambition, and a complete disregard for the humanity of its inhabitant. The whispers reached her first. They were like the rustling of silk, faint and indistinct, but persistent. She caught snippets of conversation from the guests who drifted past her hiding place. "An absolute genius, that woman. Did you see the way he looks at her? A poor Mrs. Sterling. She's never here anymore." Each phrase was a small, sharp stone thrown at the fragile glass of her composure. They were talking about Serafina, of course, and about her. She was a ghost, a rumor, a cautionary tale whispered in the gilded corners of their world. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, the velvet of the armchair a small comfort against her chilled skin. She felt a familiar wave of shame wash over her. Why was she hiding? Why was she letting them reduce her to a pathetic, pitied figure? The anger from before surged back, hot and righteous. Her gaze was drawn back to the dance floor, where Richard and Serafina were still entwined. The song had changed to something faster, more energetic, but they remained locked in their own slow, intimate rhythm. Richard's hand had slid lower down Serafina's back, his fingers splayed possessively against the crimson silk. Serafina, in turn, had her hand resting on his chest, right over his heart. It was a gesture of such casual intimacy that it made Isabella's stomach clench. It was a gesture that had once belonged to her. A wave of nausea, unrelated to her pregnancy, rose in her throat. She needed air. Pushing herself to her feet, she made her way towards the French doors that led out onto the terrace. She moved with a deliberate slowness, her head held high, ignoring the curious glances and hushed whispers that followed her. The terrace was a welcome respite from the suffocating heat and noise of the ballroom. The cool night air was a balm on her flushed skin. She leaned against the stone balustrade, looking out over the manicured gardens of the hotel. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a dazzling and different audience to her private drama. She closed her eyes, trying to find her center, to remember the woman she had been before Richard, before the betrayal. The woman who had a passion for art, a sharp mind, and a fierce, independent spirit. Where had that woman gone? "Isabella, is that you?" The voice was soft, hesitant, and familiar. Isabella's eyes snapped open. Standing a few feet away, partially hidden by a large potted palm, was a woman she hadn't seen in years. It was Chloe, a fellow curator from her old gallery. They had been close once, bonded by their shared love of art and their struggles in a male-dominated field. But their friendship had faded after Isabella married Richard, another casualty of her all-consuming role as Mrs. Sterling. Chloe looked different, more confident, her hair cut in a stylish, modern bob. She was holding a flute of champagne, but her eyes were filled with a genuine concern that momentarily disarmed Isabella. "Chloe," Isabella said, her voice hoarse. "It's been a long time." "Too long," Chloe replied, taking a step closer. "I almost didn't recognize you. You look, well, you look beautiful, as always. But there's a sadness in your eyes." She gestured back towards the ballroom. "I saw the performance in there. It's disgusting." The bluntness of Chloe's words was a shock, but a welcome one. It was the first honest thing anyone had said to her all night. Isabella felt a crack in her carefully constructed facade. "It is, isn't it?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. Chloe's expression softened with empathy. "I heard the rumors, of course. This town runs on gossip, but seeing it, it's so blatant, so disrespectful. To you." She took another step closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, Isabella, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I overheard something earlier in the powder room. It was Serafina, talking to one of her friends." Isabella's heart began to beat a little faster. "What did she say?" Chloe hesitated, her brow furrowed with indecision. "It's not just about the affair," she said finally. "It's about the firm. She was bragging. She said that Richard has been transferring assets, significant assets, into a new holding company registered in her name. She said that by the end of the year, she'll be a majority partner. She called herself the new foundation of the Sterling Empire." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a complete erasure of her life's work. She had poured her inheritance into the firm in the early years, a fact Richard conveniently forgot to mention in his interviews. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, and now he was systematically cutting her out, not just from his heart, but from the very empire she had helped him build. The cold anger from before was now a raging inferno. The whispers and shadows had coalesced into a monstrous truth, and it was more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. Chloe reached out and gently touched Isabella's arm. "Are you all right?" Isabella looked at her old friend, her eyes blazing with a newfound fire. The sadness was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "I will be," she said, her voice low and steady. "Thank you, Chloe. You have no idea what you've just done for me." She turned her gaze back to the ballroom, where Richard and Serafina were now laughing with a group of investors. They looked so confident, so untouchable. They had no idea that their carefully constructed world was about to be hit by a hurricane, and her name was Isabella Sterling. The shadows had been her refuge, but now they were her weapon. She would use the darkness to plan, to gather her strength, and when she finally stepped into the light, she would be blinding. Returning to the ballroom felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The air, once thick with perfume and polite conversation, now crackled with a tension that only Isabella seemed to feel. Every smile seemed like a mask, every laugh a hollow echo. Chloe's revelation had changed everything. It had stripped away the last vestiges of her denial, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of Richard's treachery. This wasn't just an affair, it was a coup. He wasn't just cheating on her, he was erasing her. The knowledge was a bitter pill, but it was also a potent antidote to her grief. It had cauterized the wound, leaving behind a scar of pure, unadulterated fury. She found her seat in the alcove, but she no longer felt the need to hide. She sat upright, her spine straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She was no longer a spectator, she was a strategist, observing the enemy's movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her gaze fell upon Richard. He was in his element, moving through the crowd with an easy grace, his hand always finding its way back to Serafina. They were a unit, a power couple, the future of Sterling Designs. The thought made her blood run cold. The orchestra finished its set, and a wave of applause rippled through the room. Richard and Serafina made their way back to the main table, their faces flushed with triumph. As they passed her alcove, Richard's eyes met hers for a fleeting second. She saw a flicker of surprise, then annoyance. He hadn't expected her to be here. He had wanted her tucked away at home, a docile, pregnant wife, blissfully unaware of his grand betrayal. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, a calm sea before the storm. He looked away first, a faint flush creeping up his neck. It was a small victory, but it was a start. The host of the evening, a slick television personality with a blindingly white smile, stepped back up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "before we continue with the festivities, we have one more special presentation, a surprise announcement from the man of the hour himself, Mr. Richard Sterling." A hush fell over the room. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew with a dreadful certainty what was coming. This was it, the public unveiling of his new life, his new partner. Richard strode to the stage, a confident smirk playing on his lips. He took the microphone, his eyes sweeping the room before landing, deliberately, on Serafina. Thank you," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Tonight has been a phenomenal success, a testament to the hard work and dedication of my entire team. But there is one person whose contribution has been truly transformative." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the anticipation build. Serafina Dubois is more than just a talented architect. She is a visionary. She is the future. And that is why I am thrilled to announce that as of this morning, Serafina is no longer just a senior architect at Sterling Designs. She is my new partner and the vice president of the firm. The room erupted in applause. The sound was deafening, a physical assault on Isabella's senses. She watched as Serafina, feigning surprise, walked to the stage. She was a consummate actress. She embraced Richard, a long, lingering hug that was far from professional. He kissed her on the cheek, his lips brushing against hers for a moment too long. They stood there side by side, a united front, the new king and queen of the architectural world. They were smiling, waving to the crowd, accepting the adulation. And in that moment, Isabella saw them for what they truly were. Two deeply flawed, ambitious people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, searing wave that threatened to consume her. She could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was the jilted wife, the tragic figure in their little drama. But as she looked at Richard's triumphant face, a strange sense of calm settled over her. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was no longer overwhelming. It was fuel. He had intended this to be her final humiliation, her public execution. He wanted to break her, to force her to retreat into the shadows, a forgotten footnote in his glorious life story. He had miscalculated. He had forgotten the woman he married, the woman with a spine of steel and a will of iron. He had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. She stood up, her movements graceful and deliberate. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She would not flee. She turned and walked, not towards the exit, but towards the ladies' room. Her reflection in the ornate floor-to-ceiling mirror was a shock. The woman looking back at her was pale, her eyes wide and haunted. But there was a flicker of something new in their depths, a spark of defiance. She had let Richard define her for too long. She had allowed his ambition to eclipse her own. No more. She reached into her small, elegant clutch and pulled out her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, dialing a number she knew by heart. It was a number she hadn't called in years, a bridge she thought she had burned. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The phone rang twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered. "Hello? David," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's Isabella. I need your help." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. David was her estranged brother, a brilliant but ruthless journalist who had a knack for unearthing secrets. They had fallen out years ago over Richard, whom David had never trusted. "He's a shark, Bella," he had warned her, "and you're swimming in his ocean." She hadn't listened. Now she was drowning. "Bella?" David's voice softened with concern. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "No," she said, the single word encompassing a world of pain. "But I'm going to be. Listen, I don't have much time. I'm at the Sterling Gala. Richard just announced that his mistress is his new business partner. She took a deep breath, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. But that's not the whole story. He's been funneling money, assets, everything into her name. He's trying to erase me, and I'm pregnant. Silence on the other end was heavy, charged with a protective fury she hadn't heard in years. "That bastard," David finally growled. "Where are you? Don't move. I'm on my way." "No, don't come here," she said quickly. "Not yet. I have a plan. But I need you. I need you to be ready. I'm going to give you the story of a lifetime, the fall of the Sterling Empire. Just tell me what to do," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I'll burn his world to the ground for you." A small, genuine smile touched Isabella's lips for the first time that night. "Oh, don't worry," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a promise of the storm to come. "By the time I'm done with him, there won't be anything left to burn." She hung up the phone, a sense of empowerment surging through her. The unveiling was not over. The main event was yet to come, and she would be the star. Richard and Serafina thought this was their night of triumph. They were wrong. It was the beginning of their end. The ladies' lounge at the Astoria Grand was a sanctuary of marble, silk, and rose-scented air. It was a world away from the battlefield of the ballroom. Here, Isabella could finally breathe. She leaned against the cool marble of the vanity, her reflection a fractured image in the mosaic of mirrors. The woman in the glass still looked fragile, but her eyes were different. They were the eyes of a woman who had been to hell and was walking back out, not with scars, but with a sword. Her plan was audacious, risky, and utterly terrifying. It was also the only way. For months, she had been a passive victim in her own life, buffeted by the winds of Richard's deceit. Now she would become the storm. She had one chance, one moment, to reclaim her narrative, to expose the truth before Richard could bury it, and her, completely. She took out her phone again. Her first call had been to her brother, her fire. This one was to her anchor. "Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice soft but firm when the elderly woman answered. "It's time. Could you please bring the car around to the front entrance? And the bag I packed." "Of course, my dear." The housekeeper's voice was a warm, steady presence in the chaos of Isabella's life. Mrs. Gable had been with her since she was a child, a silent witness to her joys and sorrows. She knew without being told that tonight was a turning point. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. It wasn't much time. Isabella took a deep breath and began to transform. She had arrived tonight as a shadow, a whisper of the woman she once was. She would leave as a queen, ready to reclaim her kingdom. First, the dove-gray dress, the color of mourning and invisibility, had to go. She unzipped it, letting it pool at her feet like a shed skin. From her large, oversized clutch, a bag she had chosen for this very purpose, she pulled out another dress. This one was the color of midnight, a deep, inky blue that seemed to drink the light. It was a custom-made gown, one she had commissioned weeks ago from a young, up-and-coming designer. It was elegant, sophisticated, and, most importantly, designed to showcase, not hide, her pregnancy. The silk jersey fabric draped beautifully over her body, the empire waistline accentuating the gentle, perfect curve of her belly. It was a declaration, a statement of life and defiance in the face of so much destruction. Next, she redid her makeup. She had worn muted, natural tones earlier. Now she applied a bold crimson lipstick, the color of power, of passion, of war. She swept a shimmering silver shadow across her eyelids, making her eyes look larger, more luminous. She unpinned her hair, letting the long, dark waves cascade over her shoulders, a stark contrast to the severe, tight chignon she had worn upon her arrival. The woman in the mirror was no longer a ghost. She was a goddess of vengeance, beautiful and terrible. As she was putting the finishing touches on her transformation, the door to the lounge swung open. It was Chloe. Her eyes widened in surprise, taking in Isabella's new look. "Wow," she breathed. "You look incredible. What are you doing?" Isabella turned, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I'm changing the narrative," she said simply. She looked at her old friend, her heart filled with a sudden rush of gratitude. "Chloe, what you told me tonight, It gave me the courage to do what I should have done a long time ago. Chloe stepped forward, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. Be careful, Isabella. Richard is a powerful man. He won't go down without a fight. I know, Isabella replied, her voice steady, but he's not the only one with power. He's forgotten that I have my own resources, my own allies. She paused, then took a leap of faith. Chloe, I need one more favor. I need a witness, not just for what's about to happen, but for what he's done. My brother is a journalist. He's going to break the story, but I need someone on the inside, someone who can corroborate the details, someone people will believe. Chloe didn't hesitate. I'll do it, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. He's gotten away with this for too long. It's time someone held him accountable. A wave of relief washed over Isabella. She was not alone in this fight. She had her brother, she had Mrs. Gable, and now she had Chloe. It was a small army, but they were loyal, and they were fierce. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Gable. I'm here, my dear. The bag is with the bellman. It was time. Isabella took one last look in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, and yet she was more herself than she had been in years. She was a mother, a warrior, a survivor. She was ready. Let's go, she said to Chloe, her voice calm and clear. It's time for the grand entrance. They walked out of the lounge together, two women united by a shared purpose. As they approached the grand staircase that led down into the ballroom, Isabella could hear the music, the laughter, the oblivious celebration of her own demise. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat counting down to the moment of detonation. She paused at the top of the stairs, hidden from view by a large floral arrangement. She could see Richard and Serafina holding court, the center of their glittering universe. They were laughing, drinking, toasting to their future, a future built on a foundation of lies. Isabella placed a hand on her belly, drawing strength from the new life within her. This was not just for her, it was for her child. Her child would not be born into a world of secrets and shame. Her child would be born into a world of truth, a world where their mother was not a victim, but a victor. She took a deep breath, the air cool and sharp in her lungs. The storm had gathered. Now it was time to make landfall. The top of the grand staircase at the Astoria Grand was designed for dramatic entrances. It was a sweeping curve of marble and polished mahogany, a stage from which to command the attention of the entire ballroom. For the past hour, Isabella had been a creature of the shadows, a ghost haunting the periphery of her own life. Now, as she stood poised at the precipice, she was about to step into the most unforgiving of spotlights. Chloe gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before melting back into the crowd, ready to play her part. Isabella was alone, but for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel lonely. She felt powerful. She waited for the perfect moment, a lull in the music, a brief pause in the ceaseless chatter of the crowd. The orchestra finished a piece with a flourish, and in the fleeting moment of silence that followed, she took her first step, and then another. Her descent was slow, deliberate, each step a declaration. She did not rush. She let them see her. The first person to notice was a woman near the bottom of the stairs, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips, her eyes wide with disbelief. A man beside her followed her gaze, his jaw slackening in surprise. A ripple of awareness spread through the room, a silent, seismic shockwave. Conversations faltered, heads turned. The low hum of the gala died down, replaced by a stunned, expectant silence. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic click of Isabella's heels on the marble steps. She kept her eyes fixed on one point, one destination, the center of the room where Richard and Serafina stood, frozen in a tableau of triumph. She watched as the realization dawned on Richard's face. His confident smile faltered, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment, which quickly morphed into a dark, thunderous fury. He had thought her vanquished, sent home to nurse her broken heart in private. He had not anticipated this public, defiant return. Serafina's reaction was even more telling. Her mask of cool, professional brilliance shattered, revealing the raw, insecure ambition beneath. Her eyes, wide and panicked, darted from Isabella's face to her belly, then back again. The crimson of her dress suddenly seemed garish, a desperate cry for attention in the face of Isabella's quiet, commanding presence. The midnight blue of Isabella's gown was the color of the deep ocean, full of hidden power and unstoppable force. By the time Isabella reached the bottom of the staircase, the entire ballroom was silent. Every eye was on her. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a thousand judgments, a thousand questions, but she did not flinch. She walked forward, her head held high, a regal, almost serene expression on her face. She was not the weeping, hysterical wife they might have expected. She was a queen, returning to her court to dispense justice. She stopped a few feet away from Richard and Serafina, creating a small, charged circle of space in the middle of the crowded room. She let the silence stretch, letting the tension build to an almost unbearable pitch. She looked at Richard, her gaze level and unwavering. She saw him for what he was, not the charismatic titan of industry, but a small, frightened man, terrified of losing control. "Richard," she said, her voice clear and calm, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You seem to have forgotten something, an announcement of your own." Richard's face was a mask of fury. "Isabella," he hissed, his voice a low, threatening growl. "What the hell do you think you're doing? We'll discuss this at home." Isabella gave a small, sad smile. "We have no home, Richard. You've been dismantling it for months." She turned her gaze to Serafina, whose face had gone deathly pale. "And you," she said, her voice losing its warmth, becoming as cold and sharp as ice. "You are not the new foundation of anything. You are just a crack in the old one, a crack that is about to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down." Serafina opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked to Richard for support, but he was too busy staring at Isabella, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of the trap she had so expertly laid. Then Isabella did something no one expected. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. She placed a hand on her belly, a gesture that was both protective and proud. "Richard forgot to mention the other new partner joining the Sterling family," she announced, her voice ringing with a joy that was in stark contrast to the venom of moments before. "Our baby, our first child, arriving this spring." A collective gasp went through the room. The whispers started again, but this time they were not of pity, but of shock, of scandal, of delicious, unadulterated drama. Richard's face, which had been a storm of fury, was now a wasteland of shock. He stared at her belly, then at her face, his expression one of complete and utter disbelief. He had known, of course, but he had not expected this. This public, triumphant claiming of their child, a child he had hoped to use as a bargaining chip, a tool to keep her quiet and compliant. She had taken his secret weapon and turned it against him. She had stolen his night, his triumph, his narrative. The grand entrance was complete, but the main act, the confrontation that would seal their fates, was just beginning. Isabella looked from her stunned, speechless husband to his pale, trembling mistress. She had them exactly where she wanted them, trapped in the spotlight, with nowhere to run. The night was no longer theirs. It was hers, and she was just getting started. The silence in the ballroom was a living thing, a coiled serpent ready to strike. Isabella let the weight of her announcement settle, watching the shock and confusion ripple through the crowd. Richard, for the first time since she had known him, looked utterly lost. His carefully constructed world, his meticulously planned evening, had been blown apart by a few simple, devastating words. He had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and he knew it. "A baby?" Serafina finally found her voice, a high, reedy sound that was almost a shriek. "Richard, what is she talking about?" Her eyes, wide with a mixture of panic and accusation, were fixed on him. The united front had crumbled in an instant. Richard shot her a venomous look, a silent command to be quiet, before turning back to Isabella. His face had regained some of its composure, but his eyes were cold with fury. "Isabella, this is neither the time nor the place," he said, his voice a low, controlled growl, an attempt to regain command of the situation. "You're not well. You're emotional." Isabella laughed, a sound that was surprisingly genuine. The old Isabella would have flinched at his gaslighting, would have questioned her own sanity. The new Isabella was immune. "Oh, I'm perfectly well, Richard. In fact, I've never been clearer. I'm clear on the fact that you've been sleeping with your new partner for 2 years. I'm clear on the fact that you've been systematically transferring our shared assets into her name. And I'm crystal clear on the fact that you thought you could discard me and our child like one of your outdated blueprints. Each statement was a precision strike, delivered with calm, lethal accuracy. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, no longer whispers, but audible gasps of shock and outrage. The guests were no longer just spectators. They were a jury, and Isabella was presenting her case. These are outrageous, baseless accusations, Richard sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. He was losing the crowd, and he knew it. You're hysterical. Am I? Isabella raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Then perhaps you can explain the holding company, Serafina Designs LLC, registered 3 months ago? The one you've been siphoning funds into from the main Sterling account? Or the deed to the penthouse apartment on the 85th floor of your new spire, the one that was finalized last week? In her name, of course. A rather generous signing bonus, wouldn't you say? This was a blow Richard hadn't seen coming. She saw the flash of pure panic in his eyes. How could she know? The answer was standing not 10 feet away. Isabella's gaze flickered to Chloe, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Chloe's new boyfriend worked in the city's records office. It had taken him all of 30 minutes to find the digital paper trail that Richard had been so sure was untraceable. Serafina, who had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of horror, took an involuntary step back. She was not a partner in crime. She was a pawn, and she was just now realizing that the game was over. I didn't know about the baby, she stammered, looking around at the sea of accusing faces, trying to salvage some semblance of innocence. Richard told me they were separated. We live in the same house, Isabella said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. We have for 10 years. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't care. She turned her back on Serafina, dismissing her as irrelevant. Her final battle was with Richard. And you, she said, her voice dropping, becoming intensely personal, for him alone yet heard by all. You didn't just break my heart, Richard. You tried to break my spirit. You tried to make me small, to make me invisible, so you could feel big. You used me. You used my money to start this firm. You used my name to open doors, and you used my love to build a life that you were all too happy to give to someone else. She took a step closer, invading his personal space, forcing him to look at her. But you made one fatal mistake. You forgot who I am. You forgot that I am the daughter of a man who taught me to fight and the mother of a child who is giving me something worth fighting for. And then came the twist she had saved for last. The one that would not just humiliate him, but utterly destroy him. You see, when you announced Serafina as your new partner, she said, her voice deceptively sweet, you were telling the truth, in a way. She is your partner. Because as of this afternoon, I am no longer a partner, silent or otherwise, in Sterling Designs. A confused frown creased Richard's forehead. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the 51% controlling stake in this company that my father left to me in a trust, she said, her voice ringing with triumph. The stake that I, as the majority shareholder, used this afternoon to call an emergency board meeting. A meeting where we voted unanimously to accept your resignation, effective immediately. She smiled, a cold, sharp smile that did not reach her eyes. Congratulations, Richard, you're fired. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb detonating, the silence of a world ending. Richard's face was a canvas of disbelief, fury, and utter, soul-crushing defeat. He had been so focused on stealing her share of their marital assets that he had completely forgotten about the source of his true power. Her. He lunged forward, his hands reaching for her, his face contorted in a mask of rage. You bitch, he snarled. He never reached her. 2 large security guards, hired by Isabella for the evening, materialized out of the crowd, intercepting him. They each took an arm, their grips like iron. Richard struggled for a moment, a wild, cornered animal, before a voice cut through the chaos. I think you've caused quite enough trouble for one evening, Mr. Sterling. It was Arthur Kingsley, the firm's oldest and most respected board member, a man who had been a friend of Isabella's father. He stood beside Isabella, a protective, patriarchal figure. Security, please escort Mr. Sterling and Ms. Dubois off the premises. The reckoning was complete. Richard, the master of the universe, The king of his own Gala was being dragged out of the ballroom like a common criminal. Serafina, her face streaked with tears, scurried after him, a disgraced courtier following her deposed king into exile. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock, disgust, and pity. The Sterling Empire had not just fallen, it had been publicly, spectacularly, and irrevocably dismantled. And Isabella, the pregnant wife they had all pitied, was the one left standing in the ruins, the undisputed victor. The moments after Richard and Serafina's ignominious exit were a strange, surreal blur. The ballroom, which had been the stage for a grand Shakespearean drama, was now just a room full of people, unsure of what to do or say. The orchestra remained silent. The waiters stood frozen, their silver trays forgotten. The great and the good of the city's architectural scene looked at Isabella with a new kind of awe, a respect tinged with fear. She was no longer just Richard Sterling's beautiful, tragic wife. She was the woman who had brought him down. Arthur Kingsley, his hand still resting reassuringly on her shoulder, leaned in. "Are you all right, my dear?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of concern. Isabella took a shaky breath, the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins beginning to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. "I think so," she whispered. She felt a sudden, overwhelming need to sit down. Her legs felt like they might give way at any moment. Arthur, sensing her fragility, guided her to the main table, the one that had been reserved for the guest of honor. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, Richard's chair, and helped her into it. The symbolism was not lost on anyone in the room. The queen had taken the throne. Chloe was by her side in an instant, pressing a glass of water into her hand. "You were magnificent," she breathed, her eyes shining with admiration. "Absolutely magnificent." Isabella managed a weak smile. "I couldn't have done it without you." Slowly, tentatively, the life of the gala began to resume, but its character had fundamentally changed. The mood was no longer celebratory, but subdued, contemplative. People began to leave, casting furtive, sympathetic glances in Isabella's direction as they went. A few brave souls, mostly older women who had known her mother, came over to offer their support, their words of encouragement a soothing balm on her raw nerves. They spoke of her strength, her courage, her resilience. They saw her finally as her own person, not just as an extension of her husband, but the most significant encounter was yet to come. A man detached himself from the thinning crowd and approached her table. He was tall and well-built, with kind eyes and a familiar, gentle smile. It was Michael, an old friend from her university days. He had been a rising star in the art world, a painter whose work she had championed when she was a curator. They had lost touch after she married Richard, who had always been faintly contemptuous of her bohemian friends. "Isabella," he said, his voice soft, "I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry for what you've been through, but I'm not surprised to see you come out on top. You were always the strongest person I knew." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, genuine tears of gratitude this time, not of pain. "Michael," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "it's so good to see you." "I followed your instructions," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He gestured towards a discreet corner of the ballroom where a bellman stood with a large, expensive-looking art portfolio. "It's all here, the evidence." This was the final piece of her plan, the one that would ensure Richard could never rise again. For months, she had been quietly gathering evidence of his professional misconduct, not just his financial crimes, but something far worse. Richard had a habit of stealing designs from young, unknown architects, passing them off as his own. Michael, who still had deep connections in the art and design world, had helped her track down 3 of Richard's victims. Their sworn affidavits, along with the original blueprints of their stolen designs, were in that portfolio. It was enough to have him disbarred, to ruin his reputation forever. "My brother is waiting for it outside," Isabella said. "He'll know what to do." Michael nodded. "Consider it done." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "If you need anything, Bella, anything at all, please call me. I mean it." He placed a small business card on the table before turning and walking away. Isabella looked down at the card. Michael Vance. Vance Gallery. He had his own gallery now. He had succeeded on his own terms. A small, warm feeling spread through her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The aftermath of the storm was quiet, almost peaceful. The ballroom was nearly empty now. The music had stopped. The lights seemed dimmer. Isabella sat at the head of the table, a solitary figure in a vast empty room. She was no longer Mrs. Richard Sterling, the perfect corporate wife. She was Isabella, the woman who had taken back her life, her name, her future. She placed a hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a gentle flutter, as if in response. She was tired. She was emotionally drained. But she was not broken. She was free. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was a wide, open, and slightly terrifying future. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt ready to face it. 6 months later, the city was bathed in the warm, golden light of late spring. The cherry blossoms had bloomed and faded, and the world felt new again. Isabella sat on a bench in a small, quiet park, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the trees above her. She was wearing a simple linen dress, the soft fabric draping comfortably over her heavily pregnant belly. She was due any day now, and the anticipation was a sweet, humming melody beneath the surface of her new, peaceful life. The Sterling Gala felt like a lifetime ago, a scene from a movie she had once watched. The fallout had been swift and brutal. David's story, complete with copies of the stolen blueprints and the damning financial records, had been a bombshell. The article had gone viral, and the story of the brilliant, philandering architect and the wife who overthrew him had become a modern-day legend. Richard's career was over. He was facing multiple lawsuits, a professional conduct review, and the complete and utter scorn of the world he had worked so hard to conquer. Serafina had disappeared, reportedly moving back to her hometown in disgrace. Isabella felt no triumph in their downfall, only a quiet, somber sense of justice. They had built their house on sand, and the tide had come in. Her own life had been a whirlwind of activity. Dismantling her life with Richard had been a painful but necessary process. She had sold the cold, minimalist penthouse they had shared, a place that had never truly felt like home. She had hired a new board for the company, rebranding it from Sterling Designs to Phoenix Architectural Group, a name that symbolized its rise from the ashes. She had implemented new policies, creating a mentorship program for young architects, ensuring that the kind of exploitation Richard had practiced would never happen again. She was no longer involved in the day-to-day operations, having appointed Arthur Kingsley as CEO, but she remained the majority shareholder, a silent, guiding force. Her personal life had been a process of rediscovery. She had reconnected with old friends, with her family, with herself. She had started painting again, setting up a small studio in her new, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the park. Her days were filled with simple pleasures, the smell of turpentine and oil paint, the feel of a good book in her hands, the quiet joy of watching the world go by. She was healing, one day at a time. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up, a smile instantly lighting up her face. "You're late," she said teasingly. Michael Vance grinned, handing her a small paper cup. "An artist is never late," he replied, quoting his favorite movie. "He arrives precisely when he means to." He sat down beside her on the bench. "I brought you that ridiculously complicated decaf lavender latte you like. You're a lifesaver," she said, taking a grateful sip. Michael had become a constant presence in her life over the past few months. Their old friendship had been effortlessly rekindled, blossoming into something deeper, something more profound. He had been her rock, a steady, unwavering source of support and laughter. He had helped her set up the nursery, had patiently listened to her fears about single motherhood, and had celebrated every small victory with her. He never pushed, never crowded her, but he was always there. "How's the little one?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at her belly. "Active," she replied, rubbing the spot where the baby was currently practicing its gymnastics routine. "I think we have a future soccer player on our hands." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the children play in the nearby playground, their happy shouts filling the air. It was a peaceful domestic scene, the kind of scene Isabella had once dreamed of, but had never truly believed she would have. "Have you heard from him?" Michael asked quietly, his voice gentle. Isabella knew who he meant. His lawyers contact my lawyers, she said, her voice neutral. The divorce is almost final. He's agreed to all my terms. He's not in a position to argue. She took another sip of her latte, her gaze distant. I don't hate him anymore. I just feel sorry for him. He had everything and he threw it all away. For what? For ego? For a fleeting thrill? She shook her head, a small, sad gesture. He built so many beautiful buildings, but he never learned how to build a life. She turned to Michael, her eyes clear and bright. But I'm learning, she said, a sense of wonder in her voice. I'm learning that a life isn't about grand designs and perfect facades. It's about quiet moments. It's about true partnership. It's about building something that will last. Michael reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple, comfortable gesture, full of unspoken warmth and affection. You're not building it alone, he said softly. A new dawn was breaking, not just in the sky, but in her soul. The future was still an unwritten page, but for the first time, she was not afraid. She was the architect of her own life now, and she was ready to build something beautiful, something true, something that was all her own. And now I turn the story over to you. What would you have done if you were in Isabella's shoes? Would you have walked away quietly, or would you have fought back and orchestrated a public takedown like she did? Let me know in the comments below.